The year is 1945. World War II is drawing to a close, with German surrender expected any time. In the Far East, Soviet Russia is expected to challenge Imperial Japan, and this will lead to the surrender of Japan in August 1945. And right about that time, the fate of about 30 million people is decided by the two superpowers, Soviet Union and the USA. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we're talking about Korea and what led to the country being split into North and South Korea along the 38th parallel. So we are in 1945, and victory of the Allied troops in World War II is expected to usher the dawn of a post-colonial and post-imperial world. In the Far East, it means Korea can finally free itself of the shackles of Japanese occupation. In February 1945, as the war in Europe is winding down, with German defeat and surrender on the cards, the big three Allied powers, the US, UK, and the Soviet Union, meet in the resort city of Yalta to discuss the post-war fate of defeated Germany and the rest of Europe. Along with that, they also discuss the terms of Soviet entry into the ongoing war in the Pacific against Japan, and also the formation and operation of the new United Nations. At the time, US President FDR is concerned about a protracted struggle against Japan in the Pacific War and wants to confirm Soviet support in an effort to limit the length and casualties in the conflict. At Yalta, Stalin agrees that Soviet forces will join the Allies in the war against Japan within 2 or 3 months after Germany's surrender. But he lays out certain conditions. In return for his support in the Pacific War, Stalin wants the Soviet Union to gain control of Japanese territory it lost in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. The Russo-Japanese War of 1905 is often deemed World War I because of the significance it would have on World Wars I and II. And here's where the small peninsula of Korea starts becoming of significance to the two global superpowers, the Soviet Union and Japan. In 1904, the Russian Empire under Tsar Nicholas II is one of the largest territorial powers in the world. The Tsar is looking for a warm water port in the Pacific Ocean, both for the purposes of trade as well as a base for its growing navy. The Russian port of Vladivostok, unfortunately, is forced to close for much of the winter months. So it's not suitable to meet the trade and military needs of the growing empire of the Soviet Union. So Tsar Nicholas sets his sights on the Korean and Liaodong peninsulas. The Russian Empire has already leased Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula from China. This is a warm water port, but it wants to have a base of operations firmly under its control. At the same time, the Japanese are eyeing the Korean peninsula as well to expand their influence in the region, and they initially seek to address Russia's design in the region via a deal. They are offering to cede control of Manchuria, which is northeastern China, in exchange for maintaining influence over Korea. Russia refuses Japan's offer and demands that Korea, north of the 39th parallel, serve as the neutral zone. Now let's keep in mind 39th parallel. The number is going to be very important later. So the reason for the 39th parallel is so that the largest city of Pyongyang in Korea is under Soviet control. The Japanese do not like this and instead opt to go to war, staging a surprise attack on the Russian Navy at Port Arthur on February 8, 1904. The war goes on for a while and starts heading towards a disastrous course for Russia after the surrender of Port Arthur and several other decisive losses. At this point, Russia accepts the mediation of the US President Teddy Roosevelt to sign a peace treaty. US President Teddy Roosevelt, not FDR, because we're still in 1905 and Tsar Nicholas is still around. The peace conference, which is held at Portsmouth in Maine, US, between August 9 and September 5, 1905, leads to the Treaty of Portsmouth. Japan gains control of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, and the South Manchurian Railway, which led to Port Arthur, as well as half of Sakhalin Island. Russia agrees to evacuate southern Manchuria, which is restored to China, and Japan's control of Korea is recognized. Teddy Roosevelt is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in ending this conflict. And right away, Japan formalizes its hold on Korea by forcing Kojong, the final monarch of the Joseon dynasty, to abdicate in 1907. Korean language and culture are violently suppressed, and Japan formally annexes Korea in 1910. Japan finds their domestic political power greatly enhanced by this. And post-outbreak of World War I, Japan is in a position to treat itself at par with its European allies. While the Japanese contribution in the World War I in Europe is virtually negligible, but Japan is quick to occupy German colonial possessions in East Asia. World War I leaves the great powers of Europe shattered, but it reinforces Japan's stature as the strongest military and imperialist power in East Asia at that time. Now, let's fast forward to July 1945. Germany has already surrendered, and Japan is still keeping the war alive. The Allies now meet for the Potsdam Conference in July and August 1945, and it is agreed that Soviet troops will occupy the northern portion of Korea, while American forces will take a similar action in southern Korea in order to secure the area and liberate it from Japanese control. The occupation will be temporary, and Korea will eventually decide its own political future, though no date is set for the end of the US and Soviet occupations. One must note here that the independence of Korea has been floated by the Allied powers as early as November 1943 at the Cairo Conference, but not much follow-through is done at that time. FDR also floats the idea of a trusteeship of Korea at a later conference. Stalin agrees as long as the period of trusteeship is short. August 6, 1945 marks a huge shift in the war in the Pacific as the US drops the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in Japan. Moscow subsequently declares war on Tokyo on August 8, 1945, 2 days after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and 1 day before the second bomb will fall on Nagasaki. A massive invasion of Manchuria begins the day after the Soviet declaration of war. Soviet forces also conduct amphibious landings along Japan's colonial periphery, northern territories, on Sakhalin Island, and in the northern part of the Korean peninsula. Amphibious landings, meaning use of the naval ships to project air and ground power. So Soviet Union is following through on its ask of getting back the territories it had lost in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Though many historians attribute the dropping of the atomic bombs as the reason behind Japan's surrender in World War II, but it was really the Soviet invasion that ended up being the straw that broke the camel's back, and Japan's Emperor Hirohito formally announced the surrender on August 15, 1945. Meanwhile, the Soviet troops are advancing rapidly, and the US government becomes anxious that they may occupy the whole of Korea. So on August 10, 1945, two young officers, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, are assigned to define an American occupation zone. Working on extremely short notice and completely unprepared, they use a National Geographic map to decide on the 38th parallel as the dividing line. Interesting. 38th parallel. Didn't we hear 39th somewhere earlier? Yes. And they choose it because it divides the country approximately in half and also places the other big city, Seoul, under American control. No experts on Korea are consulted. Surprise. Looks like the same ended up being done in India as well. Soviets accept this agreement. It is pretty much in line with what they wanted the boundary to be for their area of influence in Korea when Japan was negotiating prior to the Russo-Japanese War. But now it's a lot more significant and will lead to this temporary arrangement becoming permanent. Subsequently, keeping to their part of the bargain, US forces enter southern Korea on September 8, 1945. Creating the administrative boundary between Soviet Union and US along the 38th parallel, in my opinion, was the turning point in the history of a united Korea. An important point to note here is that a provisional Korean government had been in place since 1919 to push for independence from Japan. It was kind of a government which was running in exile, and it had quite a few prominent leaders like Syngman Rhee, An Jang-ho, and Kim Koo. So there wasn't any dearth of leadership on the Korean side to mandate administrative support from the Soviet Union and the United States. Another point to note is that between the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences, a lot has changed with respect to participation of the Allied powers. Since the beginning of the start of their conferences during the course of World War II, it has essentially been FDR, Stalin, and Winston Churchill. But at Potsdam, there's a big set of changes that happen. One, FDR is no more, and Harry Truman is representing the United States. And on the British side, Winston Churchill is participating, but midway through the conference, he has to give way to the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. So technically, Stalin is the only guy who's been part of these conferences from the start to the finish. And now, he may have an upper hand. And the reason I say that is because after the division of Korea administratively, you begin to see a subtle change in the Soviet policy towards Korea. So at the Moscow Conference of December 1945, there is call for a four-power trusteeship between US, Soviet Union, UK, and China with respect to Korea, which the Koreans don't like at all. And then there's a subsequent meeting in Seoul from March to May of 1946, where the Soviet delegates demand that any Korean political group that was opposed to the trusteeship be excluded from the consultations. The United States refuses, and here is where the first signs of the Cold War start showing up. Now, unlike the US forces in the South, when the Soviet army marches into the northern part of Korea in 1945, it is already accompanied by a band of expatriate Korean communists. And so it already has a plan. It knows that it wants to take this region over and hand it off to the communists who are going to be more sympathetic to the Soviets. And one of the leaders that the Soviets have brought in is communist leader Kim Il-sung, who has fought in the resistance movement against Japanese occupation with the Soviets. And he arrives in the uniform of a major of the Red Army and is introduced to the people as a national hero on October 14, 1945. So here is where you begin to see a Russian attempt to consolidate power behind a communist sympathizer and slowly start building the aura around Kim Il-sung. Now, the division across the 38th parallel has created a big economic issue. During the Japanese occupation, the industry had been segregated across Korea. Most of the fertile land existed on the southern side, so south was very much heavy into agriculture and the services sector, whereas the heavy industry, infrastructure, coal, power, etc., was more concentrated in the north. So when the Soviets come in and they see this, they are like, wow, we have just hit a gold mine. So far, they've just had a strategic interest in the northern part of Korea. And now, after seeing the way the infrastructure is set up, they begin to have an economic interest as well. And immediately, they shut off the border, and as a result, the South suddenly sees that its infrastructure needs have suddenly been cut off. Now, though the border has been sealed, but the movement of people is allowed from the north to the south, and there's a reason for that. Kim has started implementing socialist policies in North Korea, so a lot of the skilled labor who's finding it difficult to adjust to the socialist policies starts to move towards the south. The Soviets like it, so does Kim, because anybody opposing the communist rule is defecting to the south. They are totally open towards it. So in the end, because of the policies and the shutting down of the border, the north really lost the skilled labor that it had earlier. In the end, about 1.6 million people moved into the southern zone during the fall of 1945, and out of these, about 500,000 came from northern Korea and the rest from Manchuria. So allowing the exodus of these who opposed the Soviet occupation policies greatly eased the pressure of establishing political control over northern Korea, though the net cost was the loss of the highly skilled sector of the population. Now, not very significant right now, but we must stay informed that one of the commodities that the Soviet Union obtained from North Korea was a mineral called monazite, which contains small amounts of thorium, which is a radioactive material that can be used in the production of atomic bombs. And the Soviets are supposed to have made an effort to help North Korea in the development of deposits and in the organization of the extraction of the concentrate and mining of these metals. So while this is going on, the United States presents the question of Korean unification to the United Nations in September 1947. In November, the UN General Assembly in New York adopts a resolution proposed by the United States that calls for a general election in Korea under the observation of a UN temporary commission on Korea. Those elected are supposed to make up a national assembly, establish a government, and arrange with the occupying powers for the withdrawal of their troops from Korea. The Soviet Union bars the temporary commission from entering the northern zone. The South, however, holds elections under the supervision of the temporary commission on May 10, 1948. The National Assembly convenes on May 31st and elects Syngman Rhee as its speaker. Shortly after that, a constitution is adopted and Rhee is elected president on July 20th. Finally, on August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea is inaugurated with Seoul as the capital, and the military government finally comes to an end. In December, the UN General Assembly declares that the Republic is the only lawful government in Korea. Not to be outdone, in North Korea, a new constitution is adopted in April 1948, and on August 25, elections are held for members of the Supreme People's Assembly with a single list of candidates. Subsequently, on September 3, the constitution is ratified and Kim Il-sung is appointed premier. And on September 9, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, aka North Korea, is proclaimed with the capital at Pyongyang. And on October 12, 1948, the Soviet Union recognizes this state as the only lawful government in Korea. By June 1949, both the Soviet and US forces had left the peninsula. So technically, North Korea and South Korea are running their affairs independently. However, there is a burning desire on both sides to unify. But unfortunately, each side is thinking of military aggression as the channel for unification. When it comes to defense forces, the North Koreans have a slight edge over the South based on sheer numbers. But they have a strong backing from the Soviets with respect to training and military equipment. And it is with this information in mind that Kim Il-sung approaches Stalin to seek permission to invade South Korea. Now, Stalin is not interested in a direct confrontation with the United States. But Kim Il-sung makes 4 points to persuade Stalin to approve of his plan for aggression. First, it's going to be a decisive surprise attack, and the war will be won within 3 days. Second, there's going to be an uprising of about 200,000 Communist Party members in South Korea. Third, the guerrillas in the southern provinces are going to support North Korea. And fourth, the US is not going to have any time to even participate. And subsequently, on June 25, 1950, North Korea launches a full-scale invasion of the South. US President Harry Truman responds immediately and gets the UN Security Council to ratify his decision to send air and naval forces to South Korea to restore peace. And on July 4, the US ground forces in Japan under General Douglas MacArthur are mobilized to provide ground support to South Korea. But North Korean forces continue their advance, and they've almost reached the southern end of Korea when General Douglas MacArthur, the brilliant planner that he was, decides to cut off the supply chain to the North Korean forces. So on September 15, MacArthur counterattacks by an amphibious attack on Incheon, which is on the coast west of Seoul. The North Korean supply lines are cut off, and now they end up surrendering, and the US forces now start pushing towards the 38th parallel and very soon into North Korean territory. The tide is now turning towards South Korea. The US forces continue their advance into North Korea, but by November, China pushes its troops into North Korea in massive numbers. And once again, the tide turns in favor of North Korea, and the US forces are back to getting pushed back into the South. Many historians say that if MacArthur had not pushed too far into the north, China wouldn't have entered the war, and the story would have been different. That doesn't seem accurate, because Stalin was not going to let go of North Korea that easily. Remember, he had a very strategic interest, which later became an economic interest. And he also did not want to get into direct confrontation with the United States. So he had very few options. There was one loophole that he exploited when the US forces started pushing into North Korea. Soviet Union had an agreement with China to come to its aid if it got attacked by a foreign power. And by pushing China into the war, what that meant was Russia also could enter the war because it was trying to protect the Chinese interest. Technically, China was just a pawn. It was really Stalin playing his game. The seesaw turn in fortunes continued for a while, with the first proposal for a ceasefire coming up in June 1951 But again, negotiations stalled because of some touchy issues, the most interesting among them being the exchange of prisoners of war and 50,000 of them unwilling to return to their communist countries. Finally, in 1953, things started changing for the better with a new administration under President Dwight Eisenhower taking over in the United States. And in March 1953, Stalin passes away. Finally, an armistice is signed on July 27, 1953. The boundary is still the 38th parallel, but a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, is created by pulling back the respective forces 1.2 miles or 2 kilometers along each side of the boundary. South Korea's Syngman Rhee, though, was not happy that Korea was still divided, so he refused to sign the armistice, though he promised to support it. So technically, the Korean War is still on. It hasn't ended. And that was one of the conditions that Kim Jong-un put forth when he was negotiating with President Trump, that the Korean War be declared ended. The war lasted 3 years and resulted in roughly 4 million casualties. 4 million. And half of these were civilian. South Korean casualties were close to 1.3 million, and those in the north were 2.5 million, twice the size of the South Korean casualties. Why? Intense bombing by the US Air Force. The United States dropped a total of 635,000 tons of bombs, including the incendiary napalm. This is 1/3 the tonnage dropped by the US across Europe during World War II. As a result, 2/5 of Korea's industrial facilities and 1/3 of its homes were completely devastated during the war. And it has not even been 5 years since the world came out of a deadly World War II. And just like India's partition, nobody was held accountable for this deadly conflict. No commissions were set up. Nobody was investigated. And this would ultimately set the tone for the irrelevance of the United Nations in maintaining world peace in the future. Before we end today's segment, I'd just like to introduce a small quiz segment to test out our knowledge of Korea. True or false? Customers in South Korea are required by law to use Microsoft's Internet Explorer while shopping online. The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we travel slightly southwest to a region which has been in the news recently, Myanmar, and we explore how and why it got to where it is today. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.